Okay, can you still hear us okay?
Yeah.
I'm gonna come around and wave to you.
Hi.
When you're there. Yeah, that's okay.
Maybe if Myra can take care of that, or the other, if the co-host or the host. can take care
Yeah,
of that.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm here.
I wasn't there, but
Can you let folks into the waiting? Can you mute?
Now?
Yeah, I think we're okay to
Okay.
start making unmute.
Okay, everyone's joining.
Thank you.
Myra, I'll join in on my laptop too soon. It's just that
Okay.
I left it earlier. And then I come back.
Hold on.
See you. I just know you guys like her too, so we wanted to offer.
Myra, if you can hear me.
Can someone make me co-host, please?
I have this on there the whole time for.
Was in Canada, so last time.
Shelley.
Yeah.
Shall we rock your co-host now?
The thing is from that camera. So now you should be able to hear you speaking into the laptop.
Shelley, it's Sunday Lopez. One more time, if you can hear me, can you give me a thumbs up?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Okay.
And then you may want to do something about the chat thing, because that is going to pop up every single time.
Yeah.
Right, so
I turned off the previews.
I don't know if that matters sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just be up here and I can, I can just keep minimizing.
Yeah, just be aware that if you start writing some chats, it'll pop up on the screen.
I'm gonna make the microphone be the webcam.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone. We hope that you enjoyed the gourmet lunch that was provided to you. The cookies were amazing. Before I introduce you, she doesn't need an introduction, but of course I will introduce Shelley. Before we go into introductions, I just want to thank you for your flexibility and patience with trying something, a lot of new things at this conference, and one of those is trying to grant access to as many people as possible to access Shelley more, which means we're using Zoom within Web, some might be correct, but Zoom within WebEx, with this camera, with that, and thankfully Shelley is very good at this because she's very calm. So I'm going to feed off her energy. So I just want to say thank you. You may see some, I just want to make sure you may see some things pop up on the big screen, like entering the waiting room, chat might pop up. So trying to disable those things as much as you can. I need to get distracted, don't you? It's not like when people say that. I don't get distracted by that because I can call that out to you. So we wanted to just apologize. It does pop up, but know that you've got Shelley in front of you. I'm going to do a formal introduction. Wait, Shelley. Shelley, I'm doing a formal introduction, ready?
Hello, hello, hello. Hi, Victoria.
Okay. For those of you who have not met Shelley or do not know about her amazing work, originally from Edmonton and now based in Vancouver, British Columbia, Shelley is a highly sought after teacher, researcher, consultant, and storyteller. And she has worked with school districts and community organizations throughout both Canada and the United States. Her research and work has been featured at national and international conferences, and is constructed based on theory and effective practices of inclusion, special education, curriculum, and teacher professional development. Her first book, entitled One Without the Other, was released in July 2016. The follow-up her TEDx talk, hosted in Langley in January 2016. Shelley completed an undergraduate degree in special education at the University of Alberta, her master's at Simon Fraser University, and is currently a SSHRC funded PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia. To learn more about Shelley's research, take a look at her graduate profile, read her book, or her blog, Shelley can follow those things too. Give you a warm welcome to our
Hello. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Amazing. Hi. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you today. Let me just share my little screen with you. Oh, look at everyone online. Hi, everyone. Oh, this is a party. We're going to have a party. Okay, my friends. So exciting news is I'm not in Canada. I am in America, friends. I am kind of close to you. I am in Hawaii, in Honolulu. I'm here at a conference, so I'm like, ooh, I'm kind of like, you know, like I'm like the neighbor right now. So it's so nice to see you. It's so nice to be here with you today. We had a lovely fireside chat yesterday, and so today we get to kind of build on some things that we've talked about. I know that I was with you last year. We had a session together last year, so I want to kind of build on that today, and just kind of like keep going on our journey together around what this word inclusion means, and how can we constantly kind of go back and evolve our understanding and unlearn and relearn and validate and step forward and all the things we do in this important work. So before I begin, I just want to just remind you that everything I show you, I'll be posting on my website. So any slide that I show you, you have access to, you have permission to share. If you would like to share this with others, no problem. All of the slides, if you go to blogsomemore.com, the bottom website, there's a button that says handouts. Everything's organized by date, and so I'll get these posted right after the session is done. Yes? Feeling good? Okay, here we go. So my first question is actually for you, because I was like trying to figure out what we're going to do today, and I want to kind of build on what we did last time, but I can imagine that there's probably some people here who have never seen me present before, and so we need to like kind of bring them in. So we're going to do a quick little review, and then we're going to add on. Okay, you ready? So here's my first question. My first question is, what the heck does this word mean? What does this word mean? So this is what we're going to do. You're going to talk, if you're in person, you're going to talk to your neighbor for 2 minutes. What does this word mean? If you are not in person, I'm going to open up some breakout groups. You can choose to join them or not. I'm going to leave them up to you. If you are with a person, you can talk to them. If you're by yourself, I invite you to join a group, but just take a couple minutes. What does this word mean to you? And then I'll come back in 2 minutes. Okay, you ready? On your mark, get set, go. 2 minutes, everyone.
Yeah, we should moderate. Yeah.
Okay, everyone, you have about 1 minute to finish your thought. The breakout groups are closing. 45 seconds. Look how many people are here. This is amazing. Okay, about 30 seconds. Our Baker breakout groups are chatting. Okay, about 10 more seconds. All right, breakout groups are heading back. Just wait a couple seconds for everyone to get back in the room. Here we go. All right. Look how many people there are. Unbelievable. Okay, so let's do a quick review, okay? Because I'm going to tell you this word inclusion, oh, it's got, well, I mean, depending on who you talk to, it means different things. And so I told you last time about my whole long story about inclusion and why it matters to me, and kind of the barriers that our school was navigating, trying to figure this out. And one of the first barriers was we realized that we weren't on the same page about what it looked like. When we asked people what it meant, we heard common things. We heard, maybe you heard this too. It means belonging. It means community. It means relationship, safety, accessibility. And we were all aligned in terms of like our philosophical understanding. But as soon as we got to like, well, what does inclusion look like? Well, depended on who you talk to. And so, you know, when we bring our whole history of ourselves to this question of what does inclusion mean and what does inclusion look like, your understanding of it might be different depending on who you are. Maybe you have a disability, maybe your child has a disability, maybe you're a special educator, maybe you're not a special educator. And so, you know, one of the really most important kind of like aspects of, if we're going to move forward in this direction, we got to be on the same page about what it means. Now, if you Google inclusion, I always like to Google things and then press the images because I love visuals. And that's how I found this. You've probably seen this visual before. If you were with us last year, I showed it to you. And so this visual was really helpful for me for a long time because, you know, as a special educator, if you were to ask me what inclusion meant, I would have said, well, inclusion means we're including special education students into general education classrooms. Like was my definition for a really long time. And this visual really helped me to understand kind of the difference between, you know, just forceful movement of people and actually like co-constructing community together. So if you look at the visuals on the bottom, exclusion, segregation, integration, these are all versions of just how we move people around. So segregation is forced separation by group. Exclusion is forced separation by individual, and integration is the opposite of those things. It's forced togetherness, okay? And I learned the difficult way that forced togetherness and just sharing space is not inclusion. And, you know, just physically being together is not enough for me, it's not enough for any of you, and it's not enough for any of our kids. And the reason why this is important is because I get phone calls and emails all the time that says, you know, Shelley, inclusion's not working. We have so much challenging behavior. We have so much anxiety. We have kids that don't want to be included. And when I hear those things, what I'm hearing is these aren't stories of inclusion, they're stories of integration, because all of us have challenging behavior, anxiety, and non-engagement and non-attendance if the only goal is to physically be somewhere, right? And so the conversation that we had last time was like, how do we move from a container that holds people together to a community where people belong? But you can force people together and apart, but you can't force people to belong. That's why this is tricky. You have to co-construct belonging. You have to co-construct community with everybody in the community. But even with that as the definition, you often notice that a community is often created and then a student with a disability is added in after the fact. And so kids with disabilities still aren't a part of that co-construction of community. And so it's bringing up a whole lot of questions like, how do we do that? And this is why it's tricky, because that might look different for different kids. That might look different for different teachers. And so it's trying to kind of take a step back and say, you know, what do all classrooms have in common? What do all kids have in common? How can we, like, what are some guiding principles that can lead us into the direction of inclusion, but also understanding that it can't look exactly the same for every single person in every single classroom? Because as soon as we're doing that, we're not being inclusive. So this is very, very much a responsive conception. This is very, very much it's about responding to kids instead of trying to just force kids together. And this is so important. And I say this and people misunderstand me all the time, but like, I would rather a child be meaningfully included into a classroom for 5 minutes than to be non-purposefully integrated for 6 hours. Like, this isn't just about minutes. That being said, we can never stop. 5 minutes isn't enough. It's a constant striving to increase the places where kids feel that sense of belonging, because if they feel that, they're not going to have anxiety, they're not going to have challenging behavior, they're not going to be non-engaging, because that they belong there. If you think about the communities that you belong to, right, like, we don't have those feelings because we don't want to leave. We want to be there. People will miss us when we're gone. So how do we do that? How do we create those conditions? Well, so that's my spiel. You heard that spiel last time. And then the last part of the review that I'm going to show you is that I have to tell you what happened in one of my courses. I was teaching a course at University of British Columbia, and all of my students were practicing teachers. Okay. They're doing graduate work, getting their master's. And the course that I was teaching was about like inclusive frameworks. And so of course I'm going to use this slide. It's a great slide. Talk to kids about this slide, use the slide with parents. I ask kids, I'm like, who are the green dots? Like, have these conversations, they're very worthwhile. But I'm going to tell you, one of my students in my class, she saw this slide and this is what she does. She's like, I hate this slide. And I'm like, Julie, what do you mean you hate this slide? This is such a fantastic slide. Do you know what I mean? Like, what do you mean? She's like, I hate this slide. This isn't inclusion. And I'm like, this is inclusion, communities. And she's like, okay, fine. Let's talk about this slide. Okay, prepare yourselves. If you haven't heard the story, prepare yourselves. She says, Shelley, you show us this slide. So let's talk about it. Are all those green dots, are those supposed to be the normal children? And I'm like, why you got to say it like that? It sounds weird. And then she's like, oh, and these other dots, these non-green dots, are those supposed to be the special children? And I'm like, maybe, but now it sounds weird. She's like, well, let's just say that's what's happening, because that's what you're saying. She's like, I'm going to tell you something, Shelley, because I've been a teacher for a long time. The first problem with this is that I've never had that many normal children in a class. And I'm like, touche. She's like, the second problem is that I'm going to tell you what actually happens. Those red dots are attached to red teachers and they follow red plans. And the blue dots, they are attached to blue teachers and they follow blue plans. And guess what? Those yellow dots, they're attached to yellow teachers and they follow yellow plans. But you know what all of those plans have in common? They're plans to make them green. And she says, that's not inclusion, that's assimilation. And she goes, last time I checked, that's not what we believe in this country. And I was like, wow, okay, Julie, you can pass. Because what she described was this medical model of special education, right? So if you don't know, special education evolved out of a medical model, okay, which is you go to the doctor when something is wrong. And then they assess you and they diagnose you and they make you a plan to be fixed. If they can't fix you, they send you to a specialist. Sound familiar? Yeah, because it is familiar. Friends, this is the medical model, right? Like the medical model of education sees disability as something to be fixed. And she's like, we put all of these resources into these kids that aren't green, but what if they can never be green? What if that's just who they are? I was like, oh, that's a very good point. And she's just like, plus, like, inclusion isn't about changing who you are to fit into the status quo. It's not about neutralizing the diversity. And I'm like, wow, you can pass this class and teach this class. But this brought up this whole conversation about what the goals of inclusion are. Like, are the goals of inclusion to assimilate? Are the goals of inclusion to become a part of the status quo? I couldn't stop thinking about it. So then we were like, okay, well, I think a lot of people still think this. Like, inclusion means we're including kids with special needs into general education classrooms. But once I heard that, I'm like, well, that can't be my definition anymore. Because if it means that kids with disability have to change to be normalized, well, it's not valuing diversity. So now we're thinking as a class, well, what would the visual be then? So then someone in my class said, well, what if the goal is that everyone's a different shade of green? Because we were talking about how the reality of education is green. And there is a point to that, right? Like, yes, education is built on a standardized system where, yeah, the goal for a long time has been to be green. And you know when that's happening when you hear the word should. This is where a student should be. This is where they should be reading. This is how they should be behaving, like that word should. That's how you know you're getting greened. It means it's connected to average, right? But then we talked about, like, what if there are some kids who will never be where they should be? What if there's kids who will never be green? It doesn't mean they're not going to find success and happiness in the world. And we had this whole conversation about, like, you know, some of the most successful and happy people we know are people that didn't fit in the box. So, like, we couldn't stop talking about it. And then we were talking about, well, who are these green kids? And then we laughed a bit because someone's like, well, I know who the green kids are. They're the kids with all the different colored gel pens and hypoallergenic dogs and limited screen time. Like, we know who they are. They're the ones that do everything right. They hand in their homework. They make sure that they got all their books read. We love those kids because they're like us. We're like, teachers are the greenest people in the world. We love school so much, we want to stay in school forever. But, like, as our classrooms are getting more diverse, there's less kids who learn like teachers do. And so we're like we're struggling. But here's the other thing, what we're realizing. There are a whole bunch of green kids who are doing everything right. And they're reading all the books and they're getting all the scholarships and they're playing all the sports. And they're actually getting into the world and having a hard time. And this is causing concern around the world because the kids who are playing the game are even struggling. Because the skills that greenness values are no longer the skills of society today, right? Those are skills of the Industrial Revolution, where sameness was a value, because if you had to work in a factory, you want your workers to be as identical as possible. So this is causing huge concern. Is green the goal anymore? Is green the goal anymore? And, like, in British Columbia, where I live, our entire curriculum has shifted because of this problematic green goal where kids are doing everything right and they're getting to university and they're collapsing because they don't have the skills needed today, which are being self-regulated, being a critical thinker, collaborating with others, working with difference. The first competency in our curriculum is being joyful. You know what someone said to me once? How do you mark that? I'm like, you don't mark that. You know, what are the skills of society today? So now we don't know what to do. Me and my class, we're like, well, what is the visual? What is it? What's our goal in education right now? To pass a test? To be where we should be? To be the same as others? Like, no wonder we're having a hard time, because if the goal is to be the same as others, diversity will always be a burden. And so now we're going through all these, like, diversity, inclusion, and equity efforts in a system that values sameness. No wonder everyone's exhausted. So Julie, the original student, she says, Shelley, here's the thing. The problem with all of these diagrams is, A, we're assuming that green is the goal. B, we're assuming that if you're not green, something's wrong. But C, what happens when there's a status quo, like a majority, and kids who don't fit into that, what happens is that group, that smaller group, they start to get othered. Have you heard of that term before, othering? And the problem with othering, and you know what's happening when you hear things like this, like those people, those kids, you know that othering is happening. And when that happens, it happens all over the world. When you hear that, those people, it's communicating that group is worth less than that status quo group, okay? And that's a huge problem. It's a huge problem in, oh my goodness, not in just school, but in the world. We hear it all the time. And so, like, is maybe the fundamental goal of inclusion is to create conditions where we can't other people, right? To create conditions where you can't say those kids anymore. You know, where kids can't say to each other, those people anymore. Like, is that not what the goal of inclusion is? Like, to see value in difference instead of seeing burden in difference. So how do we communicate that in a visual? So Julie says, okay, well, if we want to stop othering, if we want to teach kids about the value of diversity by not seeing other as a problem, we have to start understanding that inclusion isn't about including an other into a status quo. We have to start acknowledging that inclusion is really about recognizing that every one of us is an other, and communities were made up of each other. And so if you look at this visual on the screen, there's no more of those kids. There's no more of those people because we're just diverse. It's the actually only thing that we can guarantee in a classroom is that kids are different from each other. And we've been fighting that system for so long that we actually see this as a problem. Because a teacher looks at this and we have panic attacks because we're like, oh my goodness, I need 25 paras for this class. And I need 30 individual education plans for this class because every single one of us grew up in a green system and we were taught to teach in a green system. And in that system, this workload is too high. This is too high because if the goal is to make all of these dots the same color, no one person can do that. And if that's the goal, diversity is always going to be a burden. People are always going to push back against diversity if the goal is to make everybody green. Not to mention the resources that get put into making people conform, making people be the same. It's the biggest waste of resources because there's kids that can't actually change who they are. We can't change history. We can't change experience. We can't change disability. We can't change race. We can't change culture. We can't change the identities that make kids who they are. And so if we're trying to make them fit into this homogenous system, this is why people are quitting en masse. It's not designed to work. It's not designed to work. The system in itself is not inclusive. It's not equitable. And so if we're really going to shift to valuing diversity, inclusion, and equity, we have to understand that the goal cannot be for everyone to be the same. The goal cannot be for everyone to be green. But what if the goal was, how do we help kids find their color? How do we help kids be brighter? How do we help kids learn from each other? Like that feels real good in my heart. But how do we do that? I don't know how to do that. Oops, close your eyes. Close your eyes. And so this is really the question. I think it's okay that we don't know how to do this. I think it's okay to admit that a classroom teacher looks at this and says, I would love to value this diversity, but I don't know how to teach this way. How do I teach grade 4 math like this? How do I teach science 10 like this? We were not taught how to do this, where, you know, kids are all different and the goal is not to be the same, even though they have to take a standardized test at the end of the year. How do I value diversity and then compare them to each other in June? We weren't taught how to do that. And in this model, I mean, disability is part of the conversation because it's a different color, it's a different identity, but then it's about all identities. It's about all of the things that make kids diverse. And so it's really shifting inclusion away from how do we include kids with disabilities into general education classrooms, and it becomes a conversation about how do we respond to diversity? How do we respond to diversity that includes disability, but also includes all of the things that make kids different? We weren't taught that. We weren't taught how to do that. And so part of this conversation is it's okay to not know what to do, but it's becoming not okay to not do something about it, because this is possible. This is absolutely possible. And that's why we're having these conversations, because the conversation is shifting from we can't do this work until to how do we do this work anyway? Because there's always going to be reasons why we can't do this work. And I hear them all the time. We don't have time. We don't have funding. We don't have people. We don't have resources. And it's true. We need so many more resources. Don't let anyone tell you we don't need more resources. but it's also taking a really hard look at the resources we're using and saying, are the resources we're using supporting the goal that we're trying to achieve? Because there's a lot of resources that are being used to counteract this model, to divide and conquer, to stream, to organize kids by color. And if the goal is for everyone to be green, then that makes sense. That makes sense to divide and conquer. But we have to keep track of the goal. The goal is not for everyone to be the same. So then this becomes this question. Think of your school, think of your classroom, think of yourself. Where are you on this understanding, this continuum of inclusion? What does it mean to you? Is your school at the point where kids are together, but they're not belonging? Are they at the point where communities are forming, but we're still about like standardizing? Or are we really shifting to communities of diversity where we value what kids bring without trying to change them? But let me tell you, philosophically is very different than practically. And I remember learning about this and I'm like, that sounds amazing, but I have no idea what to do. What do we do? Okay, so this is where now we're gonna make this even more complex, because this is where we ended in our last session. Okay, but listen to this. So so as a little side note, I'm trying to finish my dissertation, and I am closer than when we talked last time. But I hate writing. My program is very green, and I am not a very green person. And so I had to conform, and it was very hard, and it's taking me 9 years to do it. But I'm getting there. And so when I was supposed to be writing, I thought to myself, I don't like writing, but I could talk all day. And I do all the time. So I thought, it would be more fun than writing? A YouTube channel. So I started a YouTube channel. Maybe you have seen 1 or 2 of the videos. The very first video on the YouTube channel was about these dots and talking about this evolution of inclusion, talking about how we have to evolve our understanding about what it means to include others. And it's not about changing who people are, but embracing who they are. And then I asked the internet a rhetorical question. You realize that nothing on the internet is rhetorical, though. So this is the question I said. I said, in the evolution of inclusion, this is what I think it is. This idea about diversity, not just like different, not trying to like assimilate. But then I said, what do you think the next evolution should be? And this is where things get fun, because to this day, I still get emails from people telling me what they think the next evolution is. So the very first email I got was from a mom. And she said, Shelley, I know what the next evolution is. She's like, look at all these dots. Why are they the same size? What about size diversity? They should be different sizes. Those should be different shapes. And I'm like, you're so right. Because honestly, the more different these dots are from each other, the more accurate representation it is of our classroom. So if you want different shapes, go for it. If you want different sizes, have a great time. She's like, my son is a little person. One of those dots should be smaller. And I said, absolutely, you do you. No problem, no problem. Another person said to me, Shelley, COVID, we can't be together anymore. How are we going to communicate that? Maybe it needs a dotted line. And I'm like, that's a fantastic idea. So people emailing me about having a dotted line or Venn diagrams. Oh my goodness. I'm like, you know what? Great. Do it. Let's do it. Communities online. And then I get an email saying, Shelley, you only have 1 bubble on here. Kids have to feel like they belong in more than 1 community. You should have 4 bubbles. And I'm like, my slide isn't big enough for this feedback. So I made a new slide. You ready? So in honor of the feedback, here are other iterations. We have the quad model. We have the dotted line model. We have the tiny dot model. Great. All of these are fine, because what they're all responding to is this idea of diversity and belonging and space. So I'm starting to get this. One time though, someone sent me an email and it was this slide on fire. And I was like, I think they're having a hard day. I think they're having a hard day. So now I'm going to pause because I want you to chat with each other. What would you change about this? What would you add to capture what we're trying to move towards in diversity, inclusion, and equity efforts. What would you add? What do you like? What's missing? I'm going to give you 3 minutes. Okay, so either talk to your neighbor or I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. You're invited to join. 4 minutes on your mark, get set, go. Okay, rooms are closing in 15 seconds. Oh, Janie, I love that. I'll read that out to everybody. Yeah, put in the chat box what you think you're saying should be. I would be interested to see what you guys think. Okay, everyone's making their way back. Okay, we got some feedback. You ready? So Janie says the circle should be a globe, like 3-dimensional. So inclusion is universal and not just in schools. I love that. Each student dot should be multicolored because students have different traits. Oh, Janie, just you wait and see. Okay, so I love what Janie did. She threw in her ideas. So if you want to throw in more ideas, you do that because I'm going to tell you what happened next. Janie, you're going to love this. Okay, ready? So I'm at a conference and it's a rural school, rural district. So it's in like the mountains of the Kootenays. Okay, so like above Montana, not even that far east, like Idaho. Is that kind of up there? Anyways, up. And small district in the mountains, and I'm doing like, we're having this conversation and a teacher stops me in the middle of the presentation. He's like, no, Shelley, none of those. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's just like, and he said exactly what Janie said. He's like, I can't commit to a color. Where's the intersectionality? And I'm like, well, now what are we gonna do? So I really thought about this one, and I was flying home from this conference and I'm sitting on the plane and I'm like, how can we capture that all people have multiple dimensions, like multiple traits, multiple identities? And then it hit me. Okay, you ready? I don't know if any of you know this, but this game that I'm going to show you is Canadian invented. Have you heard of this one? Trivial Pursuit? Have you heard of it? Invented in Canada. So now I'm thinking about this. What if this is inclusion? Or each of us, our students, our families, our schools, each of us have multiple identities. Like we are little Trivial Pursuit pies of identity love, okay? And one of our job is to help kids figure out what their pies are. Slow clap, people. Isn't that so good? So then I'm like, okay. How do we help kids find their colors? Well, what are these colors? So then I get lost down a wormhole of Google images. Okay, ready? And I find this. So this is called the identity wheel. Okay, now I'm going to explain this to you, but understand there's more nuance than what's here. So how this works is the middle colors, the middle identities are what you're born with. And the colors on the outside are what you're born into. Okay, so it makes sense. Can you kind of see it? There's more nuance, but you kind of get the gist. Now, when I looked at this, I'm like, okay, this is perfect because I can look at this and say, who am I? What are my colors? So and I want you to do the same, like, look at this. What would be the colors that you would choose for your pie? So when I looked at this, I was like, okay, well, how do I know what my colors are? And then it hit me. I choose colors based on the communities that I belong in. And there's that word belonging, right? So I'm like, okay, so if I look at this, I have a work community. So I would pick this blue one. I have an education community. So I pick this purple one. I also have a queer community. So I'd pick this one. My family part of my pie is half the pie. And then I really realized also that like your pie pieces might change over time. So like when I was 13, my age community was the whole pie. Like my friends were everything to me. But now that I'm like an adult, my family is really important to me. But I also like, I'm Danish and I'm Canadian. Like all of these different pieces of the pie represent who I am, represents the communities where I belong. And I'm like, oh my goodness, maybe this is how we do it. Maybe this is how we co-construct and facilitate community in our classrooms, is by helping kids figure out where they belong. So then I'm like, okay. What if this is inclusion? You ready? What if inclusion is finding opportunities for kids to come together who share an identity? Okay. And this is why, like, sometimes there's misunderstanding about, you know, can all people with disability, can people hang out who all have disabilities? And this actually happened to me when I was first figuring this out. I went to this party and it was celebrating World Down Syndrome Day. I don't know if any of you have gone to the World Down Syndrome Day parties, but they're the best parties. Okay. And I was there and I'm like, is this inclusive? Like all of these people have disabilities. Like, is this inclusive? And I had to really think about it. And then I was like, no, of course this is inclusive. because it's identities coming together to celebrate who they are. That's very different than someone who's not in the community forcing people together. Do you know what I mean? It's that congregation where people choose to be together to celebrate who they are. And all of us are part of congregated communities. You could have, oh my goodness, a religious community, a cultural community, a race community, a language community, like where people are like you. Those can absolutely be inclusive contexts, right? Okay, here's a cute story. You ready? So I do some work in the North, like the actual North, not Toronto, like the North, like where Santa lives. So it's called the Northwest Territories. It just sounds cold. Anyways, a cool fact about Canada is that 80% of the population lives 100 miles from the US border. Okay, so it's very populated in the South, which means it's not very populated in the North. But there's all these communities because there's industry, right? Like the diamonds are in the North, all right? So there's this one city called Yellowknife. See, sounds cold. And so there's these cities that are kind of like spread out in the North. And because it's very, very rural, but there's also a lot of industry. There's also a lot of opportunities for people to live there. Okay, so there's often a lot of jobs, there's a lot of space. And so a lot of immigrants and refugees will go to the North because of the opportunities and the spaces that are there. So what ends up happening is the Northern communities are actually very diverse, okay? And so I do a lot of work up there to have these conversations, like how do we respond to diversity? And so I was working with this teacher and she's like, we were talking about congregation and coming together, identities coming together. And she tells me this story and it's so good. Okay, ready? So this family arrives from Syria, okay? And the little boy who's in this family is 7. And he hasn't had a lot of formal schooling and he doesn't speak any English. Okay, so now he's gone from Syria to the North Pole. You can imagine that it would be quite the culture shock, not to mention weather shock. They arrive in December, and in December in the North, there's no sun. Okay, the sun actually doesn't come up over the horizon. It gets to be like dusk and then it goes down. And so at 10:30 in the morning when kids are having recess, it looks like the middle of the night. So just imagine this from a 7-year-old perspective. He's like, what planet am I on? Okay, so he goes out to recess and he's standing on the edge of the playground and he makes this face like, where am I? So his teacher's walking up to him to reassure him that this is indeed a magical and wonderful place. And as she walks up to him, he runs. And she's like, we got a bolter. And then she looks to see where he ran to. And she looks and she notices that he runs into the playground to this other kid. And once she noticed who the other kid was, she noticed that it was another boy who had come from Syria, but it was of a different family and he had been there longer. And what had happened was this little 7-year-old heard his language being spoken. And these kids came together like magnets. And I'm like, this is such a perfect example of what we're talking about, because those two students found belonging in each other in a new context. And so I'm just like, there has to be space for that. There has to be in these communities opportunities for kids to see themselves, to see and be celebratory of their different colors. But how do you do that unless you see yourself in other people, right? And I'm like, this can't just be about diversity. This also has to be about identity, helping kids see themselves in ways that are celebrated, in ways that facilitate belonging, in ways where they can see themselves and say, hey, that's like me. That's like me. And then, oh my goodness. So I hear this story and then I sit back and I'm like, wow. From my own perspective as a young queer person, when did I first feel that looking at someone saying, hey, that's like me, I see myself in others? And honestly, I don't think I felt that until I was like 26, 27, because it wasn't a celebrated identity. Like I come from a pretty conservative place, right? And I was just like, wow, what a difference that would have made for me if I read about characters who were queer, if I learned about queer heroes, if I saw myself in what I was learning. And then it hit me like a truck, friends. Who do we learn about? We learn about straight, white, often dead men. And I think to myself, well, who's also safe in our schools, right? Like, and it hit me like, how do we teach to identity? We have to move away from just teaching to the privileged. And this is creating a lot of work. And you can call this whatever you want. You can call this all in the jargon that's flying around politically is so frustrating, because all this is, when we talk about critical race theory and cultural responsive teaching, and oh my goodness, like we're having huge debates right now in the West Coast around how do we pull in queer identity, right? Like all that means is that kids can look around and see themselves. Reading a book about someone who's queer is not going to make someone queer, but it is going to help a lot of kids feel seen who don't feel seen. And if you don't feel seen, you don't feel safe. And if you don't feel safe, you're not going to feel like you belong. And if you don't feel like you're going to belong, you're not going to feel like you're included. And I think when we think about those kids who are having the hardest time with inclusion, it's the kids whose identities we don't celebrate. I mean, when's the last time you saw a whole class learn about a disabled hero? Right? I know we're talking a lot about reconciliation in Canada with Indigenous populations and being like, when do we learn about Indigenous heroes? When are we reading books from Indigenous perspectives or disabled perspectives or queer perspectives? Like the perspectives that we learn about are from a status quo that represent the people who have the most privilege in our communities. And so this just helped me to see so much how these inclusive efforts connect so deeply to these equity and diversity efforts and how we can't separate disability from this conversation. Now, I also want to be really cautious about what I talk about because I don't represent all of these identities. I can't speak to being racialized. I can't speak to be Indigenous. I can't speak to a lot of them. But as a queer person and as a person who lives with a disability, it's fascinating to see the parallels and intersections between this idea of identity and how identity can be celebrated instead of seen as a burden. Do you see what I mean? Like, friends, this caused sleepless nights. And so this is why it's frustrating when things like this get political, because all this is helping kids learn from difference and seeing that difference can be celebrated and not something to fear. Now, that's the other part of this, because I think the first part of inclusion is how do we celebrate each other and see ourselves in other people? But then the other part of this is, well, how do we then see difference as an opportunity? If I'm purple and you're pink, how do I learn from your pinkness and how do you learn from my purpleness? That's very different than I'm purple and you're pink. I'm going to try and make you purple and you're going to try and make me pink, right? I think this is about where do we find ourselves in others, but also how do we learn from people who aren't us? And if I think about my daughter, who's not in school yet, but will be one day, and I think, okay, as a parent, what do I want her to learn in a public education? I want her to know how to read. And I want her to be able to like look around her and see opportunities in people who are different than her, not fear. I want her to look around and say, hey, you're not like me. What can I learn from you? And to see value in that instead of an opportunity to assimilate or to think that she's better than anyone else because she's going to be a very privileged person, right? And I'm like, if these conversations aren't what we're trying to do in inclusion, like, I don't know what we're trying to do. So my friends, this is my new understanding of inclusion. This isn't just about including someone with a disability, and it's not even about teaching to diversity, because I don't actually think we can teach to diversity unless we're teaching to identity. Because can we really teach to diversity if kids don't know who they are or they don't feel safe declaring who they are? It's just so exciting. Okay, I'm gonna let you chat again. Couple of minutes. I'll give you 3 minutes. What are you thinking about? What are you thinking about? What is this connecting to? What's a useful takeaway? I'm gonna give you 2 minutes and then we'll come back together and I'll tell you one more story. Okay, you ready? On your mark, get set, go. I have about 15 minutes left. Okay, rooms are closing in about 10 seconds. Sherry, that's a great question. And I'm having a great time in Hawaii. Okay, rooms are closing. Okay, so we have a question from Sherry. I hope I'm saying your name right. The question is, how do you respond to people who say that teaching about differences makes children think they are blank? And I get this question all the time, okay? And because it is specifically about queer, there are a lot of parents who are terrified that their children are going to be gay. Well, but I'm here to tell you it's actually a wonderful thing. Okay, so there's two ways to respond to this. The first one is, well, if you learn about disability, it doesn't mean you're going to be disabled. If you learn about Black history, it doesn't mean you're going to be Black. But what it does is it honors, or religion, yeah, it honors the story of people who are, right? And so if you could make a really obvious example to say, just because you learn about blank doesn't mean you're going to become blank, but it does educate people around difference and diversity. And if that doesn't work, then I just simply pull out the research and say, there's no research that shows that learning about differences and diversity is going to change someone's identity unless that is their true identity. And so I think that part of this is just, keeping the conversation away from fear, because all of those questions are rooted in fear, to say we're just learning about each other. We're just learning about each other. And it's much harder for someone to not be seen and heard and valued than it is to fear that someone's going to become something else. Because the point of celebrating identities is that, so what? So what if they become a different identity? Like that's an okay thing. There's room for everyone in the world. But I think a lot of kids are not feeling very safe or staff, even staff and families and parents are not feeling very safe because they just don't feel seen and they don't feel heard and they don't feel like their stories are valued. And that's not only harmful for them, but it's harmful for all of the kids because no one is then learning that diversity is a strength. Yeah. So always just come back to the research. But these questions are coming from a place that is that it makes sense, because this is not how we view education. This is not what we do. We actually do the opposite. And if you ask kids who they are, they often don't have an answer because they're just not used to that question. But if you ask kids who they're not, oh, they'll tell you all about it, because that's what we have valued historically, right? Like when we organize kids, we look for what they're missing. We look for what they can't do. That is the system of education, because it's this kind of like green should model, which is where should you be? And if you're not there, something's wrong, right? And so what we often do, and when I say we, I mean like the system of education, will be like, okay, so all the kids who can't do something go together. All the kids who can't speak English go together. All the kids who can't read go together. All the kids who can't behave go together. And what that's doing is we're trying to actually organize by deficit. But as we do that, what ended up happening is the identities within those deficit groups don't feel valued. Because if you think about a lot of times, kids who have a hard time reading, you know, often that's because they have some sort of learning disability. And so if we're grouping all the kids who can't read together, they're not seeing that disability as a value. And so then I always kind of think about, like, the most obvious one to me is, okay, so we group all the kids who can't speak English together to speak English, but like, how do you learn a new language, right? You immerse yourself around people who have a strength in that area, right? And looking at, rather than seeing not speaking English as a problem, like, why don't we see like the language that they do speak as a gift, right? And valuing the multi languages within a community and learning from each other and learning different languages. And I think that shares and communicates a very different message than, well, you can't speak English, something's wrong, so you need to go to the space. But then I'm like, well, what if we looked at different things that way? Like, if you need support reading, let's surround ourselves with strong readers. And if you need support with regulation, let's surround ourselves with people who are confident and, you know, like regulative and know what they need and are agent learners. Like what if we switched how we group kids and the criteria we use for support, and thinking, like, rather than always being looking for what they can't do and who they're not, it's like, how would education change if that's all we did was look for what they can do, look for what they do have, who they are, and say, how do we kind of shift the conversation? Okay, here's my last story. Okay, so okay. There was a school that I worked with, and we had this conversation, and they really loved this conversation, because they're like, yeah, like, what if we kind of play with how, like, what if we incorporate a part of our days where kids come together based on strengths, based on interests. And so they asked the kids, like, what do you love? What are you interested in? This was like elementary K to 7. And they're like, what do you love? Let's figure out how we can harness that. And they got really defeated, because you know what the kids said? Video games. They're like, Minecraft. And this town where the school was like in a rainforest on the ocean. And they're like, you like Minecraft? Like, go outside, look at some bugs. Anyways, so the teachers were getting frustrated and defeated, because they're just like, we tried, Shelley, but they weren't interested in anything. They were not very interesting people. They had no passions. And then another teacher was like, well, no, wait. If our kids aren't interesting, we need to model what it means to be an interesting person. And so rather than asking kids what their passions were, the teachers modeled being passionate people. Okay, you ready for this? 1 day a month, people. We're not exploding education. 1 day a month we can all make room for. They bring all the kids into the gym. K to 7, all the kids into the gym. They line the adults up, and these are teachers, support staff, administrators. They even brought in some parents, some high school students, like just a variety of people. And every one of those adults declared a passion, and kids chose who they learned from that day. Now, to give you an idea of some passions, there was someone who was a hiker, someone who was a surfer. There was one guy who loved boats because this is on an island. And so the kids got to learn about boats. There was someone who, one of the EAs, paras, was a quilter. They always had an Indigenous elder come in and do a language activity. And this was the whole day, cross grade, cross ability, cross culture. Like, kids got to choose who they wanted to learn from. Okay. I got to go visit them on one of the days, and I joined the carving group. And so the goal was that every student by the end of the year would have a passion, an interest that they loved. And they could choose the same one every month. But the goal was that they had to at least try 3 different ones by the end of the year. Okay. Now, of course, they tried this and it was amazing. But of course, the district's like, we need some data. So they collected data. And you know what the data showed? On this one day, fewest absences, fewest lates, fewest behavior difficulties. And you're like, why is that? Right? For the first time, these kids got to have affinities. You know, the other thing they realized is one thing that we forget about in diverse classrooms is that, you know, we can't always assume that everyone is celebrating the same holidays. We can't always assume that everyone's going to Disneyland. Oh, maybe in California they are, but you can't always assume that all kids have shared experiences outside of school. And one really inclusive strategy is to build on shared experiences, right? Like, let's read about something that we all learned about. Let's read about something that we shared an experience in. But if we're relying on experiences outside of school, well, what if they don't share the same language or culture, or, you know what I mean? Like, we can't rely on that. So what this day did, what this passion day did, is it actually created shared experiences for kids. So they brought in books about carving and boats and hiking, and they could read about them and write about those things. And it created content that they could meet learning standards in. And it was so powerful. This one day became so powerful that it became twice a month. And then they started to hand it over to kids to say, hey, how about you? What do you want to teach others? And I was talking to a group the other day about this, and so kids could offer an option on Passion Day.
That's Auntie's, you're gonna get
And so one
free,
of the
you better
adults was
know.
in one of my sessions the other day. She's like, yeah, we did this with our school, and now the kids run them.
Oh,
And she's like, I'm paired up with a preschooler next week because she's teaching me flower arranging. And I'm like,
Austina,
this is it. Like,
I wonder what my
find
son
belonging
smells
and
like. Brown eyes
interest.
for
and
sure. I
find
think like
belonging
Violet with brown
experience.
eyes.
And how do we
That's
even
really how I
foster
imagine
those
him.
things? Because if kids feel
Violet
like
with
they
no
belong
one
with
has blue eyes.
brown eyes, if kids feel
No
that
one
they
has
have
blue
a shared
eyes.
experience with others, they're going to learn others, and those are these fundamental concepts and foundation of inclusion. And it can't just be about trying to make everyone do the same thing. We can meet similar goals, but how do we create those opportunities where kids can find their place instead of trying to make everyone do it the same way? So this, my friends, brings us to my most current understanding of what inclusion is. And we've spent time talking about this. You know, this isn't just about disability. This isn't just about looking for who's different or who doesn't fit in. This also isn't about making people conform to a status quo, right? And you could talk to many different groups who have been historically marginalized to say it is exhausting if the only way to be successful is to fit in with the status quo. Like, it cannot be, that cannot be what inclusion is. Or it's really just working for the privileged. And so this is really taking a step back and being like, we need to be able to truly respond to diversity. But to do that, we have to help kids to be able to look around and say, in a way that celebrates, look, that's like me. That's like me. Look, that's like me. And that's how I know we've done it, is when you start to hear kids say that, because you can see identities in kids, but if they don't acknowledge them, we got to make it safer. So this is going to be what I leave you. Here's your challenge for the rest of the year is, how do we show kids, especially kids whose identities are not celebrated, how do we create conditions for them to look around to say, that's like me, where they can proudly say, hey, autism, that's like me, or hey, that's like me. And so I think like that's what I needed when I was when I was a youth. That's what probably many of us needed when we were growing up. And I promise you that if I had one book that had a queer character in my high school, that would have changed my life drastically. And I promise you that that book would not have made anyone else gay unless they were. And if it is, welcome, because it's a fantastic identity. And I want kids to know that earlier. With the same thing with disability, the same thing with race, the same thing with culture. And I think that's why this idea of intersectionality and the multiple identities that we have is so critical part. It's such a critical part of this conversation. So thank you for joining me for this conversation, because it just keeps getting deeper and deeper. And it's something that is near and dear to my heart, and something that is something to be celebrated. And I just am honored to be a part of your day. So thank you for joining me. I'm sorry I went over a minute or so. But that's the story. I'm just trying to get my last screen up here, but I think my screen is frozen. It is. It is. Who's wrapping us up today?
Me, I am. Shelley, we wanted to make sure. Hi. We want to make sure you can hear the applause.
Oh man, my screen is totally frozen. Oh, close your eyes. There we go.
Thank you, Shelley. It was an honor to have you. I feel like you can't hear me, so I feel like I have to speak into this.
There we go. There we go.
Oh, now you can't. You didn't hear the applause? Let's do it again.
Yay!
Thank you, Shelley. It was an honor. We hope you enjoy your time in Hawaii.
Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic day. I'll just put this up one more time so that you guys can get these slides. But yeah, someone asked about the slides. Use them, share them, have the conversations. It's worth it. It's worth the work. Go get them. I know you're making a difference, and I appreciate you so much.